Hey, thanks for joining us for today's sermon. My name is Phil. I'm one of the pastors here at Berean Baptist Church in Mansfield, Ohio. And we would love to help you connect to your next step towards following Jesus. If you visit our website at BereanFamily.com, you can reach out to us. We would love to pray for you and just connect you to the ministries here, what God is doing in our region. And so please check us out there. And here's today's sermon.
Well, good morning, everyone. Everybody having a good day so far? Awesome. Hey, how many of you have kids now, had kids at one point, or was a child? I think most of us. This is our way of looking for aliens in our midst, just to see if we have anything that kind of got through a robot or something. So when we were kids, or when you had kids, there's this rite of passage that everybody had to go through. That rite of passage came with bloody knees, hurt feelings oftentimes, a stressed out parent or two, and a child learning to be courageous. Anybody want to know what that rite of passage is? Who knows what it is already? Riding a bike. Let me show you something real quick here. I brought a bike. Actually, my son-in-law brought it for me. I'm not going to ride it because So, we got this bike belongs to my granddaughter, and it doesn't belong to me if you're wondering. So, what are these things on the back of the bike? Training wheels. You guys got this, right? Do you remember, either when you were a kid or when you were raising your kid, when those things came off? Man, I remember when I was a kid and those training wheels were coming off, I'm like, oh yeah, this is freedom. That's what this is. It's freedom. You know, I grew up a long, long time ago. Not quite as long as some of you. I'm just going to let that sit there. But a long, long time ago, and when training wheels came off, it was like, hey, I'm out of here, right? Do you guys remember those days? It's like, until the street lights come on, and for me, it was great. We didn't live in an area with street lights, so I could just be gone all night. So when the street lights come on, that was the rule for a lot of people, right? Come back in the house. What you do between then and the street lights, you know what? That's between you and the Lord. And the parents had no idea whatsoever, correct? Yeah, remember those days? Boy, it's a little different now, isn't it? Like GPS tracking devices on the back of your kid while you're with them, you know? There's some other things that are a little different too. When I was a child and had my first bicycle, a Schwinn Predator. That thing was awesome, by the way. A Schwinn Predator. It wasn't quite like this. It was similar, I guess, but with no training wheels. The pedals, though, were made out of like a torture device with spikes sticking out of them, waiting to impale your shins when you least expect it. Anybody else have those things? What were we thinking, parents? Like, seriously, you know what would be a great idea? Is if a pedal goes all the way through my son's leg. That would be fantastic. So let's design a pedal that will literally go through their leg, and then they will have no... Anyways, it's a little different. Also, there was something else that was lacking in our safety attire, right? What was that? There was something else that sometimes I forget. I hit my head so many times, right? No, we never wore helmets, like for anything. And then when I started playing football, by the way, I played football, and they taught you, you know what, you want to hit somebody? Right here. Aim with that right there. And so now I stutter. And but now kids, right, we put kids on our bicycles, and they've got the helmets on, right? They've got the elbow pads. They've got the knee pads. You wrap them in bubble tape, all of those things. What if I told you it was good for us to fall and get hurt? Oh, some of you, that's right, my kids need to get hurt now. You know what, you're all agreeing with me, but I've seen you with your grandchildren. You're the bubble wrap type, aren't you? With the grandkids. With your own kids, you're like, yeah, live, die, whatever. With your grandkids, you're like, you got to keep them safe. You know? No, I think it's good. It was good for our development to fall down and get hurt, to bleed a little, to learn to move through that pain, to be courageous, to learn to be courageous. That just because I'm hurt, it doesn't mean I'm out of it. Just because I've fallen and I'm crying, it doesn't mean the world is going to come to an end. Now, by the way, what I'm not saying is taking the helmet off your kids. Please leave the helmet on your kids, all right? Don't hear that. But I've watched it kind of just evolve over the course of my lifetime when little Johnny scrapes his knee and the parents they get all upset about it. They're like, "Oh no, Johnny, your knee," and it freaks the kid out. And if we're not careful, we'll raise the generations of cowards. Do you get that? Nothing to do with my sermon today, but I think you need to know. Johnny, yeah, cool, man. You might even have a scar. That's awesome. Come on up. Let's get over. Right? Elijah's over here back from UK. Hi, Elijah. Welcome home. And he's right now having flashbacks, isn't he? Like, it hurt really bad. Just get up. All right, son? That was just this last May. Anyway. You know, the whole process of teaching your kid to ride a bike, they have the training wheels for a while. Now they have these cool things with no pedals, and the kids just kind of scoot around on them. It's a cool idea. But at some point, you take the training wheels off, and if you remember, the kid sits on there all unstable with this helmet on, and the parent grabs the handlebar and grabs the seat, and you run alongside of them, right? And you say, keep pedaling, keep pedaling, keep pedaling, and then you kind of just let go without them knowing. They keep pedaling, they're all happy, and then they turn around, realize you're not there, and run into a tree, you know? It's pretty much the same for all of us, the same experience is there. You do that a few times, the kid realizes for a minute that he can't trust you, that you're going to let go. And so you have to convince them, no, this time I'm not going to let go, and then you let go again, and they start going. And eventually they get the idea, and they start riding their bike, right? It's through the falling down, though, that they learn to be stronger. It's through the scraped knees that help them to realize that they can get up and keep trying. And it's good for them. None of us like to see our kids going through a hard time, do we? But we all realize that they need to develop into young men and young women who are courageous. We've been now in the Gospel of Mark for several months. So we've made it all the way to Mark chapter 6. And we're still going to be in Mark chapter 6 today, and we're going to start on verse 45. We have seen a multitude of times already in the first 6 chapters where Jesus teaches his disciples what it means to walk in faith. To walk in faith, to be faithful. You know, learning to be faithful is a hard lesson to learn. Growing in faith never comes without skinned knees. You know that? Growing in your faith never comes without being hurt a little, going through some stuff. And sometimes, I believe often, God allows us to go through hard times and difficult experiences so that we can come out on the other side having grown in our faith. I want to challenge you today to start looking at the hard times through that lens. How can I get out of this hard time having grown in my faith? It's glorifying to God, it's good for you, and it's good for those who are around you. We are going to be today in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. And it's the story, the account of Jesus walking on the water in the midst of a storm. Many of you are familiar with that account. Would you join me in prayer before we jump into our text? Dear Heavenly Father, God, we thank you. We thank you for skinned knees and parents who would allow us to get them so that we could learn something, so that we could grow in confidence, so that we could become men and women who have courage and can get up once we've fallen down and been hurt. But God, I know for myself that too many times I've allowed those skinned knees to go on and to pass over without any growth in my life because I wasn't looking at the hard times through the proper lens. God, as a good father, much better than any of us as a father, you want to teach us things to make us more like your son Jesus. You want us to grow in our faith. You want us to be men and women of good courage. And because of that, God, as a good father and as a good daddy and as a good teacher, you give us opportunities to work things out even if that means falling down. God, as we go to your text today, would you just open our eyes, our spiritual eyes, so we can see those hidden things in your word clearly and take that step closer to you in faith. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 45, going through verse 52. Immediately, there's that word again, comes up a lot in Mark. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This story we see as a hint here, as a key to it, this last verse 52. They did not understand about the loaves. This account happens right on the heels of this absolutely incredible miracle that we discussed last week. 5,000 men, upwards of maybe 20,000 people in all, with women and children. In a desolate place, they can only find 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed them all. But Jesus does the incredible. The disciples come up to Jesus and say, "What are we going to do? Let's send them out. Let's let them go buy their own food, and then maybe we can figure out what we're going to do tomorrow." Jesus looks at them and goes, "You feed them. You feed them." Well, how are we going to do that? We don't have nearly enough money. There's no place to go to buy anything in the meantime, like even if we had enough money. And Jesus says, "All right, listen, this is what we're going to do. Separate them into groups of 50 and 100. Jesus multiplies the loaves and fishes so much so that there's 12 baskets of leftovers. Somebody reminded me last week, how many disciples were there? There's a basket of leftovers per disciple. They probably carried them onto this boat when Jesus says, "Guys, listen, I know this is a lot of awesome things. People, this is the pinnacle of Jesus' fame in this region." Right? This is things don't get much better. So many people have been healed. So many people have heard his incredible teaching. Now they've seen this absolutely incredible miracle. And they are now, it's getting really, really exciting for everybody. For the wrong reasons, because they do think that this Messiah is going to come and give them a political victory, that he'll drive out the foreign Romans, and they will have their home once again under their own leadership. So they have a misunderstanding here, and that plays out more as we continue to go forward. But they have all this excitement happening, and Jesus is like, "Listen, guys, get on the boat." And the disciples, I'm sure, were right there going, "I don't want to get on the boat. This is awesome. Look what's happening here. This is exciting," right? So they don't want to get on the boat. But he says, "Get on the boat. I'm going to dismiss everybody, and I'm going to go up onto the mountain and pray." So that's precisely what happens in this account. Jesus sends his disciples off on the boat. They've been in boats before, right? As many of, I think, 4 of the 12, maybe as many as 7 were fishermen. This was grounds they were well familiar with. And it wasn't that long ago that they had been caught out in a storm in that same body of water, right? Where they had to wake Jesus up because they were afraid. But again, this key, and we're going to come back to it later, they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I want to remind you again, they probably got onto that boat, each one of them having in a basket full of leftovers, getting onto this boat. Jesus has already done some incredible things. They've got a physical representation of that last miracle on their laps when they get on to this boat. My main idea this morning is this. When we are walking within the will of God, it's a long one for you note takers. I hope you know shorthand. When you are walking within the will of God, he gives us everything we need to overcome obstacles that would prevent us from doing as we are commanded. I'm going to read it a few more times as I go, so if you didn't get all that, you will. For many of us, like his disciples, it's time for us to take off the training wheels of our faith. It's time for us to take off the training wheels of our faith. Our first point is this. It's this: the disciples obeyed the command of Jesus. I hope you notice that. The disciples were doing exactly what they were told to be doing. Teaching kids how to ride a bike, you have to convince them to keep pedaling without you holding on to them, right? And again, I admitted there was a couple times where I told my kids that I wasn't going to let them go. And then I let them go anyways, right? I'm not saying that you should lie to your children. I'm just confessing that I did, all right? You have to convince them to keep pedaling, because what do they want to do as soon as they feel like you let them go? They want to stop pedaling and turn and look. And then what happens? They fall. And they get what they deserve for turning around and not doing what they were told. This usually takes a few times and a lot of convincing to happen. Eventually it will happen. And again, the way I grew up, it means that when I could ride my bike, it didn't matter how old I was probably 5 or 6, that means the world was open to me. I could just go off on my own. It doesn't mean that I should have, but it means that I would. And oftentimes I found myself in serious trouble. I was probably only about 7 years old, riding through streets in Waterford, Michigan, and I go down this hill and find this bunch of broken glass on the road. I was young and all alone, and I get to the glass and panic. I hit only my front brake. What do you think happened? Face plant into the glass, right? It's amazing I'm this good looking, because my face was just buried in that glass, and I was freaked out because there's nobody there with me. I was freaked out. There was nobody there with me. I was a long way from my babysitter's house, and it took me some time to figure out, where I was at. I hit my head pretty hard, and then make my way back to my babysitter's house for help. When we go off on our own, we can get ourselves into trouble. Sometimes we go off on our own prematurely, like I did when I was a child. But it's part of the growth. Sometimes Jesus says, guys, I've been with you a long time. Why don't you go out and take this one? Go out and take this one. Let's see how you do. Jesus dismissed his disciples for the evening and told them to go off without him. And they started off correctly. They started off in obedience, doing exactly what they were told. Verse 45, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Getting into the boat wasn't the disciples' idea. They didn't say, hey, we need to get out of here. They probably wanted to stay there. They were probably loving the moment that they were having with Jesus and these miraculous acts and the fame that was growing. They're probably enjoying every bit of that. But Jesus says, get in the boat and go right into the teeth of a storm. You may wonder, why did the disciples run into such a big problem while they were just doing as they were told? Jesus told them to go. They did what they were told to do. Why would they run into such a big problem? Why, in their obedience, were they met with this obstacle? Jesus, after all, had already demonstrated that he had power over the elements. I believe, though, that sometimes you need to learn how to get back up, to face the obstacles in your life. Even when we were kids, you couldn't guarantee safety with your own kids, right? I think sometimes pushing them into something that is difficult for them, an obstacle, can be good for their development. Apparently, Jesus agrees. He tells his disciples, knowing Jesus is omniscient, meaning he knows all things, Jesus, knowing about the storm that's going to come, about the obstacle they're about to face, says, get in the boat and go, knowing full well what they're about to face. Again, I believe it's because we grow the most in the storms of life. Particularly our faith. We have the opportunity to grow our faith the most in the storms of life. Jesus, being a good teacher, allowed them to go through trouble so that they come out having had the opportunity to grow. Listen to Philippians. Paul gives the church in Philippi some instructions here. He says in Philippians 4:6-7, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. John 16:33, I have said these things to you that in me you you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And then James 1, 2 through 4, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. There's a key to understanding these three verses. It's obedience. The context here is when we are walking in obedience to God, we can have these promises. We can have this growth. If you're out on your own being disobedient, don't expect the peace of God to overcome you. If you're going out doing what God has told you not to do, don't wonder and scratch your head and wonder why you aren't experiencing the peace of God and growth. We must be about the will of the Father, being obedient children, for this to have its full effect, to grow in peace, to grow in the faith of God when we come across these obstacles. Here's the thing, you're going to come across obstacles and storms in your life. It's better to come across them while you're being obedient than being disobedient. Because we have some great, precious, amazing promises of God that when we are going about the will of our Father and face various kinds of trouble and obstacles and storms in our lives, that He will go and be with us, that we can ask Him things in confidence, and we can have good courage. If you are doing the expressed will of God in your life, you have every reason to trust Him. You have every reason to trust Him. Main idea again, when walking within the will of God, He gives us everything we need to overcome obstacles that would prevent us from doing as we are commanded. Our second point is this. They were never really out of His sight. Physically, of course they were, but they were never really out of the sight of the Lord. Again, in teaching our kids to ride their bikes, inevitably they will grow more confident and more competent and will ride out of our sights. It's just a natural part of growing up. Now, as you parent, you try to prolong the time you can watch over them as long as you can, unless you're like old school parents. You're like, why are you still here, right? I just think about some of the things. My friends' parents used to write little Johnny a letter to take to the party store to get them a pack of cigarettes. And then we were like 6, 7 years old riding our bikes down the main road with this little letter to buy his parents cigarettes. It's a different world, people. And I'll never, the guy who ran that party store was the third grade teacher at our elementary school. Mr. Kletke, if you're watching, I remember your name and that you sold cigarettes to children. All right. Don't act surprised, you guys did the same stuff, all right? Now, as a parent, again, you try to prolong it as long as you can. In the case of our disciples, they were never truly out of the Lord's sight. Listen again to verses 46 through 48. And after He had taken leave of them, He went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and He was alone on the land. And He saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, He came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by. Seems kind of peculiar. We're going to address that in just a moment. Not going to spend a lot of time in this spot because just a couple weeks ago I preached on the need for us to rest. And seeing how God, Jesus, took time to rest to be with His Father in quiet places. And we see this yet again, that He goes up into the mountain. Just Him and His Father. I want to say this, guys, because we need to catch this. We need to catch this. We really, really need to catch this. If it was important for Jesus to get away from the crowd and have quiet time with the Father, is that much more important for us? Is that much more important for us? So many of us are walking around almost anemic because we're not spending time with the Father. Don't allow yourself to be so busy that you don't have time to spend with the Father. You don't have time not to spend time with the Father. You don't have time not to. Listen, I was in a class all week this last week. I'm working on a doctorate degree because Pastor Phil's put me to shame, and I'm like, oh great, now I got to do it too. So I'm in Chicago in an intensive all week long. Yesterday was the day I got to come and to really work on a sermon. I would never normally tell you that, but it makes sense in just a moment. How do you think I began my time in sermon preparation yesterday, having just a few hours to work on it? You guys have good confidence in me. Thank you. Quiet time with the Father, poring over His Word, asking Him to make it come into my heart and to change me. Why is that when I have so much work to do? Because I didn't have time to start it any other way. The same is true for all of us, guys. You don't have time not to pray. You don't have time not to have quiet time with the Father. Time is fleeting. It's here today. We're gone tomorrow. Spend time with your Father now. You can't afford not to. We just can't. Now, moving forward here, I said I wasn't going to take much time on that, and then I did. Fourth watch, you might have caught that there was in the fourth watch. The fourth watch, it has to do with the Romans taking and having like a watch out every night, and they had different watches, obviously. The fourth watch meant 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. That's when the fourth watch was. So the disciples now had been rowing in this storm for hours. It should have been a 1 or 2 hour boat ride. And they were for hours fighting against this storm. The disciples find themselves in a bit of trouble, really coming into a desperate situation. They'd been rowing for several hours, but again, I want to remind you, Jesus knew all along what was taking place because He is omniscient, meaning He knows everything. Proverbs 15:3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Jesus knew exactly where they were. He knew exactly the trouble that they were in. He knew exactly what they were up to in the conversations that were taking place in the midst of it. And Jesus, again, showing that He has authority over the physical world, during a storm, walks out onto the sea. He walks out onto the sea, onto the water. Most translations, by the way, to deal with that last sentence there, He meant to pass them by. Most translations agree or say it similarly as the ESV, the translation that we use, in their interpretation of 48b, where it says He meant to pass them by. There are some commentaries, however, or commentators who have read this text in Greek and have a little bit of a different view of what that translation means, including John MacArthur, who would say he believes that in the Greek, what the sense of what's being said is, He desired to come alongside them. He desired to come alongside them. This seems most likely to me. If Jesus could walk on water, know everything that was going on, if He wanted to sneak past them, I think He could have. Right? Oh, you caught me. Right? It just doesn't seem like that's probably what happened. Again, our main idea this morning is this. I got to pick up my pace here. When walking within the will of God, He gives us everything we need to overcome obstacles that would prevent us from doing as we are commanded. So the big question. Jesus is omniscient. We know that He loves His disciples. He cares for them. He wants them to grow, all these things. Why did Jesus knowingly send them out into the storm? He knew the storm was coming. He knew it was happening. And our third point is this: the disciples had more to learn. The disciples had more to learn. As I've already mentioned several times, part of learning how to ride a bike is learning how to get hurt and getting over it. Right? And moving on. Verses 49 through 52, but when they saw Him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they saw Him and were terrified. And let's be fair here, I'd be a little freaked out too, right? But immediately He spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And He got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They were exhausted, several hours of rowing. They were not sure what to do next. They think they see a ghost coming out onto the water. The Greek word for ghost here is phantasma, from which we get our English word phantom. It was superstitiously believed that seeing a spirit at night during this first century was a sign of impending disaster. They see what they think is this ghost, and they think it's a sign, and they're all dead men. So they start crying out. They're freaking out at this point. Jesus then calms their fears by revealing it was him and not a ghost. By the way, the word he uses to identify himself here is really important because there is a claim that happens in this text, these just few words that Jesus said that we could easily overlook. It says this, the word he uses here is important. The text says, "Take heart, it is I," right? And then it says, where am I at here? "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." In Greek, there's only 3 or 4 words here for that sentence. But there's an important word here. And the word is imi. And it's a verb, and it's where it is I is one word. It's imi. It's a verb, and it literally means I am. It literally means I am. So what's Jesus say here? Take heart, I am. It's a claim of his deity. They would have understood it as claiming his deity, this I am statement. In Exodus 3:14 we see, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." So the great I am walks out onto the water to rescue these disciples. But back to the lesson the disciples still needed to learn. Again, I said this already, a key to understanding this text is found at the end. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So what exactly did they not understand about the loaves? Let's look back, verses 35 through 37 in chapter 6. "And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them to eat?'" Do you notice this? Jesus says, "You go give them something to eat." Jesus had been doing all of these miracles and doing all of these things in front of his disciples and saying, "Guys, you in faith can do this." These guys were out in a storm again. Jesus was sleeping on the boat the one time. They wake him up. "Jesus, you got to help us." Right? We'll come back to that. Because they forgot what they learned the last time they were caught up in the storm as well. Verses of chapter 4, verses 37 through 40. "And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?'" They're probably thinking the same thing again. "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." What did he say to them? He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" You see what happened in this storm, the disciples were on their bikes. And they didn't realize, when they realized that Jesus had let them go and they were pedaling on their own, they freaked out. They turned back and looked, "Help us, we're going to die." And then they crash. Jesus is saying, "I've already demonstrated this for you. Have some faith. Have some faith. You're doing what I told you to do. And because you're doing what I told you can do, you can trust me." Go to the Father in that moment. Don't panic and allow yourself to drown and die. Go to the Father in that moment. "You are doing my will. You will be safe. I will be with you." The disciples needed to understand that faith is a verb, something that they must do. They needed to understand that they had been commissioned and empowered to do the will of God. And they had nothing to fear, including the storm. And an important thing to remember is that we have the same Spirit in us that raised Jesus from the dead. We have the same Spirit in us that raised Jesus from the dead. That God will answer our prayers and give us what we need as long as we are doing His will. So first off, be about the business of the Father. It's the safest place for you to be in the midst of the obstacles and the storms. The obstacles and storms are a guarantee. You're going to be in them. Be about the will of your Father. And if you are in the will of the Father, you have nothing to fear. You have nothing to fear. When walking within the will of God, He gives us everything we need to overcome obstacles that would prevent us from doing as we are commanded. At this time, I'm going to ask the men to come forward. We're going to have the Lord's Supper. We're going to take that together and invite Isaiah and Sadie out onto the stage here for our final praise song as well. And as they're coming and preparing the elements, I want to give you our challenge for this week. We're kind of in a rhythm with a unique way of doing a challenge. Can I get some? Thank you. And we're going to stay with that today. And today, what we're doing here is really meditating and focusing on the Lord's Word. And this idea of growing in faith, again, one of the keys here is being about the will of the Father. That's a key here. But God certainly wants us to grow in our faith. And today I want us to, or this week, I want us to spend 30 minutes to an hour, just one time, in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, known as the Hall of Faith. The 4 R's that we're going to be having you do. First, read it. Read it aloud get into a quiet place. If you need to, if you're like, listen, I only have a half an hour, set a timer for 30 minutes. Read Hebrews 11 aloud 2 or 3 times. Spend the next few minutes reflecting on that word. Respond in prayer. Praying back the scriptures to the Lord can be a powerful exercise. Respond in prayer, and then take at least a few moments to rest in that word, just quieting your mind and resting in His word. So that's our challenge. The disciples, back to them, they would likely could have just prayed and had faith in the face of the storm and would have been fine. Why is that? Why can we go to the Lord with such confidence? For them, it was because they were obeying, because God was with them as they were obeying Him. We remember that this relationship we have with the Lord came at an incredible price. You see, we remember the cost that was paid by Jesus so that we could turn to Him in our times of trouble. The fact that we can turn to Jesus and as being obedient to Him, as we're going to the Father and praying in the name of His Son, Jesus, we can have confidence that He's going to hear us. Why? Because of the cost that was paid on our behalf. We remember that cost here at Berean every month as we take the Lord's Supper together. In addition to remembering the cost that was paid, we also remember that He's going to return. That today, while we're on earth, we take these elements together, but one day there will be a supper, a feast with the Lamb in His presence. We remember that He will one day return. If you are a guest here and not a member, we have what we call open communion, which means if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you're welcome to partake with us. If you've not yet surrendered to Jesus as your Lord, just go ahead and pass the plates by you. We have the 2 cups that are stacked. If you kind of twist a little and pull out, you'll be able to reach in the bottom the little wafers that are there. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to have a moment, a time of reflection before we take together. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I thank You for this day. God, I thank You for the breath in our lungs. God, I thank You for those scraped knees. As You've kind of let go of the seat and the handlebar and allow us to move out and to remember that we can have faith and trust in You, that we can turn to You, and the fact that we can turn to You because of this terrible cost that was paid on our behalf. God, as we're bowing before You in this next moment or two, would You just speak to us the sins in our lives that we can confess them to You and repent from them, meaning turning all the way from them and growing in our faith. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 23. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me."